What is happening across the European continent right now in terms of the atmospheric pattern that is driving the weather conditions being experienced by hundreds of millions of people from the Iberian Peninsula to the Scandinavian coast, from the British Isles to the Balkan states, from the Mediterranean shores, where temperatures have been reaching levels that break records established in previous heat events that were themselves already extraordinary by historical standards, to the northern latitudes, where weather patterns are simultaneously producing conditions of a completely different but equally consequential and equally concerning character, is a meteorological development of extraordinary complexity, extraordinary geographic scope, and extraordinary consequence for the health, the safety, the agricultural productivity, the energy systems, the water resources, and the daily lives of the millions of European citizens who are living through a weather situation that the atmospheric scientists, the meteorologists, the climate researchers, and the emergency management professionals monitoring it across the continent are describing with the kind of professional alarm and professional urgency that the scientific community reserves for situations whose potential for human harm, for economic damage, and for the kind of catastrophic outcomes that inadequate preparation and inadequate public warning can allow weather events of this severity to produce is genuinely serious enough to demand the most comprehensive and the most urgently communicated public information effort that the meteorological and emergency management communities can mount. Europe's heat is splitting in two, and that phrase, however evocative and however meteorologically accurate as a description of what the atmospheric pattern over the European continent is producing, does not begin to capture the full complexity, the full geographic detail, and the full human consequence of a weather situation, whose two distinct but simultaneously occurring and simultaneously dangerous components are each severe enough to constitute a major weather emergency in their own right, and whose combination across the European continent creates a compound weather situation of extraordinary geographic scope and extraordinary human significance that is affecting different populations with different hazards, different intensities, and different timescales of impact in ways that require different responses from the governments, the emergency management systems, the public health infrastructures, and the individual citizens of the many different nations and regions that are experiencing the split heat patterns contrasting manifestations simultaneously. The first component of Europe's split heat pattern, extreme and in some areas record-breaking heat that is dominating the weather conditions across southern and southwestern Europe, with temperatures in parts of the Iberian Peninsula, southern France, Italy, Greece, and other Mediterranean nations reaching or exceeding levels that pose direct and immediate danger to human life for vulnerable populations, including the elderly, young children, people with chronic health conditions, outdoor workers, and anyone without access to adequate cooling. And that are simultaneously imposing severe stress on agricultural systems that are already under pressure from years of drought conditions, on water resources that have been depleted by a combination of reduced precipitation and increased evaporation, on energy systems that are being pushed toward their operational limits by the surge and cooling demand that extreme heat generates, and on the natural ecosystems of regions that have been experiencing temperature extremes and drought conditions that are transforming the biological and hydrological character of some of the most ecologically significant and most culturally important landscapes in the world, is the component that is generating the most immediate and the most visible human health emergency, producing the heat-related hospitalizations, the heat-related deaths, the overwhelmed emergency medical services, and the disrupted daily life that the most extreme heat events in European history have produced before, and that the current event is producing again with a ferocity and a persistence that the meteorological record is documenting as among the most severe manifestations of extreme summer heat that the affected regions have experienced in the period of reliable instrumental temperature measurement. The temperatures being recorded across the most severely affected portions of southern Europe, temperatures that in some locations have reached or approached the 45 degrees Celsius threshold that represents not simply uncomfortable or even dangerous summer heat, but a level of thermal stress on human physiology that the human body struggles to manage even with unlimited access to shade, cool water, and rest. A threshold beyond which the risk of heat, stroke, organ failure, and death rises sharply, even for individuals who would normally be considered healthy enough to tolerate extreme heat without immediate medical consequence, are temperatures that the public health systems and the emergency management infrastructure of the affected nations are racing to respond to with the cooling center expansions, the elderly welfare check programs, the public communication campaigns about heat safety, the hospital, preparation for increased heat illness admissions, and the energy system preparations for the peak demand events that these extreme temperatures generate that constitute the standard toolkit of heat emergency response. The agricultural consequences of the extreme heat dominating southern Europe are unfolding simultaneously with the public health emergency and with a severity and a scope that will take months to fully document. But that the early assessments from agricultural monitoring organizations and national agricultural ministries are already describing as severe across multiple crop categories in multiple countries, with the combination of extreme temperatures and inadequate soil moisture that drought conditions have produced across large areas of the Mediterranean agricultural zone, creating conditions in which crops planted with normal growing season expectations are experiencing heat and drought stress that is reducing yields, accelerating ripening in ways that compress harvest windows and reduce quality, killing plants outright in the most severely affected areas, and threatening the viability of agricultural operations in regions whose entire economic and cultural identity has been built around the cultivation of crops that the current climate trends are making increasingly difficult to grow reliably. The water resource crisis that accompanies and amplifies the extreme heat across southern Europe. The depletion of rivers, reservoirs, and groundwater systems that the combination of reduced precipitation, increased evaporation from extreme heat, and increased demand from agriculture, from household cooling use, and from the hydroelectric power generation that many European nations depend upon for a significant portion of their electricity supply is a crisis of extraordinary severity in some of the most severely affected regions, with river levels at historic lows, reservoir storage at critically reduced levels in some watersheds, and the water allocation conflicts between agricultural users, municipal water systems, and environmental flow requirements that drought conditions generate beginning to intensify in ways that are testing the water governance frameworks of multiple European nations and creating the kind of zero-sum resource competition that severe water scarcity inevitably produces when the available water is insufficient to meet all of the demands being placed upon it simultaneously. The energy system. Implications of the extreme heat across southern Europe compound the public health, agricultural, and water resource dimensions of the heat emergency, with a fourth category of consequential impact that affects every sector of the society and the economy simultaneously, because the surge in electricity demand for air conditioning and cooling that extreme heat produces is occurring at a moment when the capacity of energy generation systems to meet that demand is itself being affected by the same heat conditions that are driving the demand increase, with nuclear power plants that depend on river water, for cooling being forced to reduce output as river temperatures rise above the regulatory limits for cooling water discharge, with hydroelectric generation being reduced by the low water levels in the reservoirs and rivers that feed hydroelectric facilities, and with the solar generation capacity that has become an increasingly important component of European electricity supply facing the efficiency reduction that very high. Temperatures impose on photovoltaic systems, creating a situation in which demand is at or near its peak, while multiple categories of generation capacity are simultaneously impaired by the same heat conditions, driving that peak demand. The second component of Europe's split heat pattern, the one that is occurring simultaneously with the extreme heat dominating the south, but that is expressing the atmospheric split in a completely different way across the northern and northwestern portions of the continent, where the same large-scale atmospheric pattern that is trapping hot air over the south and producing the record-breaking temperatures in the Mediterranean is also directing a different and in some ways equally problematic weather regime across northern Europe involving persistent rainfall, significant flooding risk, below normal temperatures, and the kind of extended wet and cool. Conditions that pose their own distinct set of challenges for agriculture, for infrastructure, and for the populations experiencing what is, in some respects, the meteorological opposite of what their counterparts in the south are enduring simultaneously, is a component of the overall European weather situation that deserves attention and serious analysis alongside the extreme heat emergency to the south, because its consequences, while less immediately life-threatening than the dangerous heat temperatures in the Mediterranean zone, are nonetheless significant and, in some categories of impact, are producing outcomes that are comparably damaging to agricultural productivity, infrastructure integrity, and quality of life for the millions of Europeans living in the regions where the cool and wet component of the split heat pattern is dominant. The persistent rainfall and flooding risk that the northern and northwestern European component of the split pattern is producing, driven by the positioning of the jet stream that the large-scale atmospheric pattern has placed in a precipitation without producing the overbank flooding that inundates floodplain communities, damages infrastructure, disrupts transportation networks, and threatens the lives and the properties of the people living in flood-vulnerable areas, is at or near its practical limit. The agricultural consequences of the persistent rainfall and cool temperatures in northern Europe mirror but contrast with the agricultural consequences of the extreme heat and drought in the south. with northern European farmers facing the challenges of waterlogged soils that prevent field operations, delayed harvests that expose crops to the quality deterioration that excessive moisture produces in mature grain crops, increased disease pressure from the fungal and bacterial pathogens that thrive in cool and wet conditions, and the mechanical and logistical difficulties of conducting harvest and field operations in conditions where the ground is too wet to support the weight of agricultural machinery without, causing the soil compaction and the crop damage that forced wet weather field operations inevitably produce. Challenges whose cumulative impact on northern European agricultural output in the current season is already being assessed by agricultural monitoring organizations as significant across multiple crop categories and multiple production regions. The human health implications of the cool and wet conditions in northern Europe, while less immediately dramatic than the life-threatening heat emergency to the south, are nonetheless real and concerning from a public health perspective, because the combination of persistent cool temperatures, reduced sunlight, and the psychological impact of extended periods of gray and rainy weather that is characteristic of northern European weather patterns, when the blocking high that is driving extreme heat in the south simultaneously directs an extended series of Atlantic weather systems across the northern continent, is a combination that has well-documented effects on mental health, on vitamin D levels that depend on sunlight exposure, on the physical health of populations whose outdoor activity is curtailed by persistent poor weather, and on the general quality of life and sense of well-being that sunshine and warm temperatures reliably support during the summer months that northern Europeans particularly value because of the contrast they provide with the long, dark winters that characterize the northern latitudes. The implications for European energy systems of the split heat pattern, the combination of extreme heat-driven demand increases in the south and reduced renewable generation capacity from the hydro constraints, the nuclear cooling limitations, and the solar efficiency reductions that extreme heat produces, simultaneously occurring with the northern European conditions that are affecting wind generation patterns and hydroelectric capacity in different ways across different regions of the continental energy grid, create a compound energy challenge for the interconnected European electricity market that is more complex and more difficult to manage than the energy implications of either component of the split pattern would be if it were occurring in isolation. The climate context of Europe's split heat pattern, the relationship between this specific weather event and the broader climate trends that are affecting European weather patterns with increasing frequency, increasing intensity, and increasingly severe consequences, that the scientific consensus on climate change attributes to the warming of the atmosphere and the oceans that has been occurring as a result of greenhouse gas accumulation, is a context that the meteorological community is carefully documenting as providing the background conditions of elevated ocean temperatures, modified atmospheric circulation patterns, and increased atmospheric moisture content that make extreme weather events of the kind that Europe's split heat pattern is currently producing more likely, more intense, and more consequential than comparable weather patterns would have been in a cooler climate. The preparation and response actions that European governments, emergency management systems, public health agencies, or energy system operators and individual citizens need to be taking in response to the split heat pattern that is affecting the continent, with such varying but consistently significant impacts across its geographic breadth, include the heat emergency responses in the south that this video has already described, the flood preparedness and response actions in the north that the persistent rainfall and flooding risk demands from residents of flood-vulnerable areas, the energy conservation measures that both components of the split pattern are making urgently important for reducing the stress on energy systems that are managing elevated demand and constrained supply simultaneously, the agricultural adaptation measures that farmers across the continent need to be implementing to minimize the losses that both the extreme heat in the south and the cool and wet conditions in the north are imposing on the current season's crops, and the water conservation and water management measures that the extreme heat and drought in the south are making urgently necessary for preserving the water resources that agriculture, municipal water supplies, and ecosystems across the most severely affected Mediterranean regions depend upon for their continued function. Europe's heat is splitting in two. The consequences for millions of Europeans are unfolding across every sector of the continental society and economy simultaneously. The meteorological community is watching the evolution of this extraordinary atmospheric pattern with professional alarm and communicating its implications with the urgency that the scale and the severity of the human and economic consequences demand, and the response from individuals, from communities, from national governments, and from the European institutions whose mandate includes coordinating the continental response to weather emergencies and climate challenges of this magnitude, needs to be as comprehensive, as urgent, and as seriously grounded in the scientific understanding of what this split heat pattern is doing and what it is likely to do next as the scale of the emergency and the millions of people whose health, safety, and well-being depend on that response genuinely and urgently demands. Like this video, if this complete, detailed, and genuinely important analysis of Europe's split heat pattern and what it means for millions of people across the continent gave you the meteorological understanding, the geographic specificity, and the human consequence awareness that this extraordinary continental weather event demands from anyone who wants to understand what is happening, why it is happening, and what needs to be done in response to a weather situation affecting hundreds of millions of Europeans, with impacts ranging from life-threatening heat in the south to significant flooding and agricultural disruption in the north. Subscribe to this channel for the kind of serious, scientifically grounded, and genuinely important weather and climate coverage that the most consequential atmospheric events affecting Europe and the world deserve from anyone committed to providing their audience with honest, complete, and actionable information about the weather and climate developments that are shaping the safety, the economy, and the future of the continent and the world. And tell me in the comments where in Europe you are located and which component of the split heat pattern you're currently experiencing and how severely it is affecting your daily life and your community. See you in the next one.